Welcome back. This next video is going to cover the types of data that we have and the types of dashboards that we have in learning analytics. So in this very short video, we're going to give you an overview of the different kinds of data, but we're also going to give you an overview of the different kinds of dashboards and how they use these data types. Particularly, we're going to talk about our goals for visualization and learning analytics, and we're going to give you a couple of examples building on the dashboard that we've been looking at so far over the course of the last few videos. Now, in terms of data types, there's mathematical classifications that I'm sure you're learning about in the other areas of this course, and possibly you've learned about in, a ton of other classes. I'm sure there are a lot of you that have a lot of experience with this. So we might have continuous data, so how much time somebody spends can be measured in a very continuous fashion. We could have discrete data, so the number of times that people are clicking on links is going to be a whole number. We can have ordinal data where a student is going to rate their interest from 1 to 7 or rate it with a nominal label on it. We might have that nominal label show up in other cases where we have, something like the student qualifies for a free and reduced price lunch, which is usually given in a yes or no. This is a measure of socioeconomic status in the United States, since we tend to give that only to people whose parents are really not making a whole lot of money. So beyond that, we could look at different data types in an educational lens, right? So might have assessment data that would be, how somebody performs on assignments or tests, what their grade is when they've completed it. But because learning analytics often has access to online learning systems, we often have what we call process data. That's how those assignments and tests were completed. How long did it take? How many guesses did they make? Was it their first attempt or their second attempt? Were they using hints and so on? Right. In some cases, we also have some student data. So we might have demographics or personal characteristics. In many cases, we don't have this information, but we would probably benefit from it in many cases, right? And then finally, we would benefit from having more contextual data. So the type of contextual data that we typically see in learning analytics is sort of the homework versus classwork. We can infer if somebody is working on something at 7 o'clock at night that they're doing it for homework rather than for classwork if they're in the standard US K through 12 system, right? Our schools tend to run, 8 to 3 roughly. But all of the other contextual information that we might want, is really, really hard to obtain. So we don't know if somebody's working another job, if they've got, a bunch of other kids running around in the background, if they have heat in their home. In January in the north, that could be a really big, important contextual distraction. And, these kinds of things are very rarely available to us. What is usually available to us, again, this is typical process data in an online learning system. We typically have correct and incorrect answers. We can usually apply Bayesian knowledge tracing that you're learning about in this course. We can look at the number of actions they've had beyond just clicking on the correct answer, the total number of actions, the timing of them, the sequences of them, and so on. Um, Again, the context is more difficult to obtain, and so is the student information. It generally requires the school being willing to, give us information, that we would have to obtain outside of the system. We don't typically build a lot of surveys of motivational constructs into online learning systems, for example. Um, and so we need to be uh, thinking about these kinds of information as it is really well known in other educational communities that it's important, but we often don't have it ourselves. Right. Now, sort of this primary data can then be used to construct models of things that are maybe a little more sophisticated. So we can do mastery models based on knowledge components or skills. We could look at cognitive abilities more generally. We can model behavioral engagement, on-task behavior or off-task behavior. We can look at affective states, if we have enough other contextual information. Typically, this requires an observer in the classroom, but we can use interaction data to model things like a student's boredom or confusion or delight. If you want to Google the prompt method, BROMP. That'll give you more information about that. And then we can look at things like whether or not the student is gaming the system or otherwise abusing help, right? So are they going through very quickly without reading and just guessing as quickly as they can? Are they behaving in a way that looks to be careless? So they're missing a lot of things that we think they know, and so on. We can then use this information from these various sort of primary things, measures, to build long-term analyses. And we've used these in a lot of studies so far that you've probably started to hear about in this course, um, to look at, short-term learning, did they pass the test at the end of the unit? Long-term learning, how did they do at the end of the year on this state exam? We've looked at, longer term interest in motivational constructs, and then very long term outcomes like which fourth grader will go to college and how selective is that college, and do they finish with a STEM degree, right? Now, these are all really great things to have when they're used very carefully to support the student. Um, and there are things that we should be thinking about, who needs access to that information. And, conversely, all right, if we have different groups of people, what kind of information do they need? So the field is starting to make the distinction between academic analytics, which would be, numbers that the administrators are in need of, versus learning analytics. So the people that are directly involved with learning do need a lot of this process and assessment data really to contextualize that information and to know how well people are performing, right? If somebody is working tons and tons and tons of hours and they're still not performing well, but all we have is the assessment data, is very likely that a teacher is going to look at that information and say, oh, you need to study harder. And in fact, that child or that adult is working themselves to the bone, right? They're just really, really, really struggling and they need additional information about what they should be doing differently. Now, academic analytics, for people that distinguish between the two, is different, right? It's information on course enrollment over time or the grades across different instructors to predict how many students are going to need the next course in the sequence, and so on. Now, the other kind of distinction we want to make with dashboards is between descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive data. So when we have a dashboard that only has descriptive data, it's telling us how the student is performing now, right? That doesn't give us necessarily a whole lot of information about how likely the student is to pass the class. It may be really common in a particular class for everybody or for a large portion of people to fail a particular quiz. That doesn't mean that they won't pass the class, right? It might mean that they will really struggle with a second quiz that happens later in the semester, and we could give them some information um, that would help them to study in a more effective way when that material comes back around again, right? But just giving them the prediction that, oh, you failed quiz 2, now you're going to fail quiz 7, may not tell them exactly what they need to study. And that's where we need prescriptive dashboards, right? So based on how the student is doing now, and usually historical data, what do we think the student needs to do to improve, right? So to change the future, we need to be able to know a little bit about the data and the different kinds of students and their learning experiences, so that we can make appropriate recommendations. Now, if you guys recall with Professor Q's organic chemistry class, we've already said, this is not a predictive dashboard in its current state, right? We have a very descriptive overview of what's happening. And in order to get this to a place where we're actually giving somebody really actionable information that they wouldn't know themselves, we need to think about how we might present that. Now, so far, the data here is not processed data, and that's going to make a lot of things really uninterpretable in terms of what the student needs to do differently. But we could still do some predictive warnings, right? So we might say something like students with an average below 85 or with more than 2 failing quiz grades are not likely to pass the final. These are those 4 students, right? And then the teacher would still have to figure out what to do about it, but it would be a prediction that would help to highlight the particular students that are most in need of help. And then we have a second warning here that says students who scored less than 50 on any exam are not likely to pass the final exam, and we've highlighted a student who has done that as well. Now, again, that's a warning, right? Um, we could also think about a nudge, right, which would maybe push people to do things a little bit differently. Students who perform below average on quiz 6 need remediation on the calculus involved with reaction times, especially if they also did poorly on quiz 3. In this case, we didn't actually highlight that information, that the instructor would have to go find it. And here's nudge 2. Students who scored C or lower on quiz 7 spent less time doing homework. Um, so the nudge here might be tell them to do more work, um, make sure that they're putting in adequate studying time. Maybe even instead of calling them out, just say, hey, everybody in this course needs to do a little more studying time because it's probably not going to hurt most of the students. So, what we're seeing from the research is that supporting students is probably going to require us to amalgamate all of these different kinds of data, right? We need descriptive data. We need to see exactly how students are performing. But even the teachers are going to need both, predictive and prescriptive data in many cases, right? It's going to help them to know what to do to support students. And to get that kind of predictive and prescriptive data to be effective and accurate, um, we're going to want both the assessment data and the process data. These are the things that help us figure out what's happening with a student. And like I said, unfortunately, we probably also need a lot of other contextual information from outside of their learning actions. But there's a lot that we can do when we have just the learning actions. We can at least eliminate whether or not it's something like, the student is not opening the textbook, in our case, the online learning system. We have that information in front of us for the most part, right? And we can move forward accordingly.